Welcome to Module 19. Module 19 takes a step back from the mechanics of creating policy models as we've been used to in the previous chapters, and discusses a functionality of policy modeling which is of primary importance for every rule author and every project manager to know about. It's the concept of being able to build test cases. We're going to talk about what makes a test case in policy modeling, how to build them. There are more than two different ways to do it. How to run test cases. There are 3 or 4 different ways to run a test case. And a couple of extra points just for reference when it comes to working with entities and when it comes to working with temporal data in test cases. First things first, a test case is created as part of your policy modeling project. A test case is one or more scenarios, complete with data, that allow you to test whether your policy model is doing what it's supposed to do. In the case of a benefit engine, maybe you will use it to test whether, given the right inputs, with the right individuals, with the right personal circumstances, the correct benefit is output. Test cases exist for so many different reasons. For initial testing, does my logic stand up? For regression testing, we've made some changes. Has it in some way disturbed the logic? Or any other reason that you could think of as part of your testing strategy. I'd go so far as to say that a project that doesn't have test cases isn't really a project at all, because there's nothing to prove to the business, to the people who run the project, that we've actually done what we set out to do. Test cases, as you can probably see here on the screen, they're organized into folders. So I would strongly recommend that you add 1 or more folders, one for unit testing, one for functional testing, one for regression testing. It's entirely up to you. And you'll notice also that each testing file is an Excel spreadsheet. You can tell by the icon. So each time you add a test case, you're going to be adding a physical Excel file to your project, and it's going to be sitting there on your hard drive. I want you to notice on the right-hand side that we've got the add and the add folder button. We've also got the delete button, so you can delete a test case file that you don't need. And on the left-hand side, you can see there's a run button and some information about running. This run button will execute all of your Excel spreadsheets and all of the test cases that you've placed in the Excel spreadsheets. So it gives you a global picture of whether everything is working as intended. You might click it, for example, in order to regression test all of your rules because you've just made a change. But fundamentally, creating a test case is no harder than creating a file in this window. Opening an Excel test case in policy modeling, we'll see a different toolbar than we're used to, because the functionality of a test case is designed solely to let us build scenarios and execute those scenarios. If you're coming from version 10, you will have seen that in version 10 there were actually 2 kinds of test-related files. Broadly speaking, we've brought all of that under one roof in version 12. I want you to notice in this toolbar, you have a run button, just like we had a run button when we were looking at the user interface a moment ago. This will allow you to run individual test cases as opposed to running them all. And you will also notice a debug button, so that if you have a test case that's not doing what you think it's supposed to do, or you're just intrigued by it, you can click the debug button, but all that will come in a moment. Building a test case. Well, there are 2 ways to do it. You can either edit the Excel file yourself manually, or you can use the debugger to help you. You may remember that in the debugger there's an export button. So if you've built an interesting scenario in the debugger and you want to turn it into a test case, you can simply export it as a test case. And I'm going to demonstrate both of those in just a moment. Either way, your Excel spreadsheet will typically look like this, an array of colored columns. The colors are meaningful in the sense that the green columns are input data and the brown and the yellow are some form of output column. We'll talk about the differences in just a moment. I'm going to switch over to an example project now, and we can look at building test cases. So here I have a very simple project. It involves a garage, or a mechanics factory, a mechanics garage, if you will. It involves car repairs, wheels, and bolts, and invoices. It's not a very sophisticated garage, I grant you that. So I want you to notice here on the global entity, there is an attribute called the customer is content. The customer is content if the garage is clean with free coffee. It's nice to make a good impression. So these two attributes are going to be the basis for my first test case. I want to investigate the behavior of the customer is content. So I'm going to do, first of all, it's going to do it the manual way. I'm going to add a folder. Let's call this example. And I'm going to add a file. And I'm going to open the file with Excel. There we go. I'll make it big. And I'll zoom in a little bit. You'll see that the file itself is bare because we haven't done anything yet, but there's one piece of information that is important. We have a test case called test case number 1. Each test case in the test cases tab will have a unique number. If I click add entry, I beg your pardon, let's do that again. If I click add row, I'll get row 2, row 3, row 4, and 5, and so on. So basically, every test case will have a number, and we will use this number to refer to it, and we will use this number to link elements together in this test case. So now I'm going to add one or more columns, and I'm interested in, you may remember, this concept of the customer being content. So I'm going to select the customer is content. You'll notice that the Excel spreadsheet knows about my attributes. And I now have to decide what kind of information I want to have in that column. So you'll notice it says expected. I could choose to have the actual values, the expected values, or both. Let's start off by saying I want the actual values, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment, and I'll add the garage is clean with free coffee, the other part of our little example. And I'll click add. Notice how the green column represents the information that I must provide. I'm the person designing the test case, and I provide the input. The customer is content I set as an actual column. So the results of my tests will actually be displayed here. So I don't have to fill them in. So I'm going to say the garage is clean with free coffee, and I'm going to say false, true. I'm going to be lazy, and for the purposes of my example, I'm simply going to delete the other 3 because with only 2 potential choices, I don't think we need to have more than 2. I'm going to now click the Run button, and both tests will be executed. Test case 1, the answer is, according to my model, the customer is not content. The answer is false. Or the customer is content in the second example. So the actual outcomes have been updated. That's because I asked for the actual. When you're running your first test, it's generally the actual you want to see, because you want to see, do I actually get an answer? Let's take another example, and let's add, this time, manually, an expected column. I'm going to add an expected column, and I'm going to add the customer is content. I'm going to add it as an expected this time. Don't need that extra column. Take that extra column away. So now you'll notice that I have the customer is content twice. Once is the actual value, once is my expectation. So if I'm pretty certain that, yeah, the customer's going to be happy here, and the customer's going to be happy here, you can probably guess that this kind of approach is going to be useful when we're doing regression testing, when I already think I know the answer, and I want to check if there's now a divergence between what I'm expecting as the answer, based on previous experience, and what is the actual answer. So to make this even more interesting, I'll blank those off and we'll run it again. So now OPA is looking at my expectations and saying, look, I updated these two like you asked, but one of them didn't match what you were expecting. That is really useful because it highlights perhaps things that have changed since the last time that I ran this, or things that have changed in my understanding. That's weird, I thought it was going to be false, or I thought it was going to be true and it says it's false. I wonder what's gone wrong. So using the expected values tends to be when you already know, or you think you know, what the value is going to be. If I have need to dig even deeper, I can now click the debug button, making sure that I select test case number 1. I'm going to click debug, and it will switch to our friend the debugger. It will load in all of the data and let me experiment with, okay, the customer is not content. False. And I can use typical debugger tools like show decision and say, okay, why is the garage is not clean with free coffee. Oh, I get it. Okay, so yeah, I understand now. So it's the relationship here. Okay, so basically I can switch backwards and forwards between the test case and the debugger if I need to. So building test cases is a combination of creating inputs in green and dealing with actual and expected outcomes, and using the debug button when things get a little bit interesting. Reviewing the answers provided, reading the messages that pop up, and generally learning about my test cases. If I return briefly to the application, you will notice that on my test case screen, it reminds me that I have one failing test case. So if I run this, if I have multiple files here, I might still see, okay, I've got multiple test cases, but there's still one that's failing. And this icon reminds me that the failing test case is in this file. There are a couple of other features that are useful. If you come across a scenario that you're really interested in, and you want to keep a copy of the data for reference purposes, you can use the Keep button. The Keep button does exactly what it says on the tin. It copies it into a new column. The new column will not be touched in any way, shape, or form by any further activities, so you can use it as a reference. So if you want to keep a copy of some data and then copy and paste it into other columns, but keep it as a reference, Keep is a good one. Many test cases have to deal with the fact that it's not just about a single attribute or a global attribute. You have entities and child entities and other attributes within those child entities. We still need to be able to create test cases even when there are multiple entities. And in a moment, we're going to see how that works. Before we go into detail, I want to show you this screenshot because it gives you a hint about how this is going to work. Notice how you can see here, I'll come back a slide, the expenses, not the expense, but the expenses. You will recall that when you build an entity such as the expense, a containment relationship is created, which you can name, for example, the expenses. So what you're doing here is you're actually not just saying that test case 1 has an expense, but test case 1 has several expenses. You'll notice here that there's several elements of data. So what this is saying is somewhere in the test case Excel spreadsheet, there's information about expenses. And this is 1, 2, 3, 4 different expenses. So these 4 had better be in the Excel spreadsheet somewhere for us to be able to leverage them. But at a simple level, if you're comfortable with the idea of entities and containment relationships, this should make sense. What we're saying is test case 1 contains the following expenses. Let's take a shortcut to creating a new test case to examine entities. You may remember earlier on we used the debugger. And you may remember that in the debugger we have cars. I'm not going to add a car, I'll say that it's a Ferrari, not the same as a Ferrero, and it's owned by Steve, and its registration is XYZ123, and so on. So I could now add wheels for the car. Let's make it nice and simple and say that this is the left front wheel that has caused problems. And as you probably know, that a wheel is held onto the car with a bunch of bolts. Let's say bolt number 1 has been secured. Bolt number 2 has been secured. Bolt number 3, I'll only do 3, don't worry. Bolt number 3, let's try and get it the right way. There we go. Bolt number 3, let's say, has not been secured. So what have I just done? I have created in the data tab a car called a Ferrari, and I've created a wheel, and I've created 3 bolts for the left front wheel. Bolt number 1 is secured. Bolt number 2 is secured. Bolt number 3 is not secured. So, naturally enough, I don't want the customer to drive away because the bolts are not secured. So what I've done is I've generated an invoice for Steve, because it's Steve's car, but I've said the invoice can't be sent because the car is still in the garage, the bolts haven't been tightened enough. So I'm going to go back to bolt number 3 and say, now we've finished our work, and the invoice is now ready to send, and I invoice a flat rate of $20 per wheel, so I just sent an invoice to Steve for $20. And you're thinking, okay, so what? I want you to take a look at the invoice, and you'll notice there's an attribute called the invoice can be sent. The invoice can be sent uses a bunch of intermediate attributes. It says the invoice can be sent if, for the given car that is on this invoice, for each of the wheels of the car, the bolts are secure. So basically it runs down the hierarchy and says, are all the bolts secure? And you're thinking, okay, so what? Let's imagine that I now want to use this data structure, all this car, this bolts, this wheels, everything, in a test case. I'm not going to create it manually because it would be quite hard work. Instead, I'm going to go to the export button, export as test case, and say Steve Ferrari example. I'm going to wait a few seconds, and in the background, Intelligent Advisor is creating a new Excel spreadsheet. The Excel spreadsheet has appeared. Just to highlight it, it's now sitting in my test cases screen, so I can now move it into another folder if I wish. Let's take a look at my Excel spreadsheet. My Excel spreadsheet, and I'll zoom in a little bit so it's a little easier to read. There we go. At first glance, you're thinking, oh, hang on a minute, what's all of this? But actually, what's really happened is, in my test case, it has created for me not just the original test case tab that we had before, not just the basic inputs like is the garage clean with fresh coffee, what are the cars, but also it's entered the car, the wheel, the bolts for the wheel, and each of the bolts, and the invoice line. So it's reproduced all of the structure of my data model in the Excel spreadsheet. What do I want you to remember when you look at this? I want you to remember 3 things. First of all, you'll notice that I can add, for example, let's add another car here. And let's say that there's also a Mini that belongs to Steve as well. And it's ABC123, and it's the right rear wheel. We could say that this is only valid for test case number 2. You can probably see where I'm going here. I can now create test case number 2 and say the coffee is clean and the only car that's involved is the Mini. So test case number 2 will essentially ignore the Ferrari if I say the Ferrari is only for test case number 1. So I can leverage the test case numbers to make sure that the test case engine knows that, hang on, the Ferrari is for test case number 1, the Mini is for test case number 2. You will have also noticed that there was a keyword in there that said all, which basically allows me to say this car applies to all, or this invoice applies to all. And I can now go through this, and I'm sure you've worked out how this happens, is I can create a test case and say the left front applies to all test cases. Well, actually, no, it doesn't. It only applies to test case number 1. And I'll add another row and say test case number 2 is the right rear. And the wheels are going to be B1, B2, and B3. So in this case, I'm actually using the bolts that I created for one test case, and I'm using them for all test cases. So a combination of using unique numbers or the keyword all allows me to align different entities together in a test case. And I can run my test cases and see what gives. All tests successful. Yeah. And I could add, let's add another column and say, let's say the customer is content. Oops, I beg your pardon, the customer is content. I want actual values. So I only want the actual values. And I could repeat this, for example, on the invoice. And I could say, okay, let's add a new column to the invoice tab and say, can the invoice be sent? And what's the invoice amount? And we'll have the actual values again. So if each entity includes its own attributes that are calculated, I can add them to the relevant tab. And I can run my test. And I can see that the customer is content in scenario number 2, that in car number 2, sorry, I beg your pardon, I'll get there in the end. Invoice number 2, yeah. Invoice number can be sent, yeah. And it's Steve, XYZ123. And I can add a bolt here. So I'm going to add a row. And I'll say this bolt only applies to test case number 2. It's bolt number 4, and the bolt is not secure. So bolts 1, 2, and 3 apply to both test cases, but bolt number 4 is only used in test case number 2. So, and what I'll do is, for my invoices, we'll have, well, I'll leave the invoices as they go, and I'll re-debug. And in this case, we'll see that I have a problem with the invoice, because the invoice is unknown. Because I've set up 2 separate test cases, they actually should be generating the 2 cars should be generating 2 separate invoices. If I go to debug, you'll see I get an error. So there's an issue with the way my data is laid out in the test case. It's not being interpreted correctly. So you'll get used to these kind of things happening. So I will say test case number 1 and test case number 2. And invoice will be, I can actually copy that from my example, is Steve Ferrari. So this will be Steve ABC123. And I'll rerun my tests. Up. Because in my data model, each car that was being repaired created a separate invoice. Once I created a scenario where test case number 1 was going to generate a different invoice or a different outcome to number 2, I needed to make sure that my invoice tab had the necessary information. This is a key point, is that when you're dealing with inferred entities like the invoice, you'll notice that the invoice is listed as input, that's the green color. So I had to provide the framework telling the test case that I'm going to have 2 invoices because there are 2 cars. Then it is able to populate the different attributes of the invoice. So in summary, when you're working with entities, you have a tab per entity, even if it's an inferred entity. And if it's an inferred entity, you still need to build the framework. So in my case, I had to build 2 test cases, each with its own invoice, so that the test case engine was able to populate the different attributes for the 2 invoices. Coming back to our presentation, when you're working with test case concepts, the fundamentals are this. Every test case has a number, and every entity tab can have rows that are connected to that test case. So in this case, you can see I have three expenses that apply to all scenarios and a couple that only apply to scenario number 2. You have to get used to manipulating those numbers. If you fail to do it, 2 things might happen. One, in the case of an inferred entity, like the example I showed you, you might get an error when you try to debug, or you get an unknown value showing up in your test case, because I'd forgotten that in my model, each car created a new invoice. So if I added a second car, I had to build the framework in the invoice tab so that it knew that I was expecting 2 inferred invoices. If it's just a case of you have got your references wrong, where you've said that a particular element applies to a particular test case, but then you've said that it applies to another, you can expect a message like this saying, this expense, Hotel Mercure, I'm not supposed to be seeing it in test case number 1 because on the other tab, you told me it applied to test case number 2 or whatever. So you need to get used to building what can be quite complex layouts. So this is the test case tab, this is the employee tab. So you have Bob the employee, who applies to all test cases. He's employee number 1. He has certain expenses. Those expenses will be on another tab. So I'll need to make sure that I've linked the correct expenses to the correct employee. If you're working in a language other than English, the comma that you see between the expenses may be different. And a final point to add extra complexity is if you're working with temporal data, you can have it in your test case, but you need to use the curly brackets that we saw earlier. So in this case, you'll see I said it's 200 from the 1st of January, 185 from the 2nd of January, and so on. So it is possible both to have as output and as input temporal data. A key concept that we saw earlier, which I want to come back on and just reinforce is, do I want expected values or actual values? You can have both, but if you're dealing with a brand new rule, well, you're maybe going to focus on actual because you don't know actually what the answer is. If you're regression testing, you're probably going to be far more interested in expected results because you think you already know the answer. Last week, when everything was perfect, these were the answers. So you might want to use expected and you might want to use the keep functionality that we spoke about a minute ago. Running test cases can be done in one of 4 ways. You can click the Run button in the Excel ribbon. You can click the Run button on the Project tab. You can use the command line interface called OPM Test, or you can bring it all together and use OPM Test within a larger environment, such as using Jenkins or Node.js or some sort of automated engine so that you test automatically every midnight and you send emails to everybody to say which tests have succeeded and which tests have failed. What do I want you to remember? I want you to remember that test cases are immensely powerful because a test case proves that your policy model works. 2, test cases have a big advantage. They're relatively simple to understand. So it's a good idea to involve people from the business in building test cases because they're the ones who know what happens for real. So if you're dealing with a benefit system or you're dealing with a discount system, they're the people, the salespeople, the benefit agents. They're the people who can give you the scenarios that will really test your engine. Secondly, you can build up complex layouts using entities and temporal data, and it takes a little bit of getting used to. Finally, you can automate running test cases using either the command line or something more sophisticated. There'll be a demo of those features in just a moment, but for now, that's it.